You're watching Experience Comic Culture and Sales. Streaming live daily to Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter.
2, 1.
When I was 20 years old, I got a job working for a company, and it was my first ever content creation job. I had just graduated with my first degree and was re-enrolling in college to get my second. And this company offered me a really great job that I enjoyed, making graphics, doing social media, doing content creation, making web content for them. And I worked for that company in various roles. After I left that job, I moved into another job. And then after I left that position, I moved into another position, to the point where at the time, I was the youngest executive ever at the largest privately held company in the United States. And then some of my management, some of my bosses changed, and their beliefs about how things should be done changed, and I was let go. Now, when I was let go, I thought, okay, you don't need my position anymore. You're going a different direction. Let me get the stuff that I made while I was working here. Let me get the content. Let me have proof that I did anything. And they wouldn't give it to me. And I had to sue them. It's the largest privately held company in the United States. I couldn't really afford to sue them. So when they countersued for contract violation and things like this, because I had made content for other people, I had no real ramifications. I had no real recourse in that situation. And it broke my heart because I was going to be transitioning into another content creation job because it's what I did. It's what I do. And I couldn't prove that I had spent 15 years of my life, give or take, working for that company. And it was devastating. I had no demo reel. All I had was a line on my resume. And it made me ask this question. And it's the question we're going to tackle tonight on the show. And it changed the way I approach business in the future. I've approached business since then. To the point where when we launched the experience, I fought with my partners in the experience, Nick and Jen, to make sure I owned the content that I made. Now, I don't own the content that goes on the air here at the experience. Everyone who makes the content here owns the content. They own what they make. But I wanted to make sure that things like the commercials that I voiced or the things that I edited were mine. And that has been a cornerstone of my life since that moment. Thank you, Matt. Hang out for the rest of the show. We appreciate being here. Murdoch, we'll get into that. But the question for the night is, can you just declare something and make it true? And who owns what we love? This is Devil's Advocates. What's up, the internet? It's producer Kyle. That there is Bronze Age Nerd. And we are here to advocate for deviling, something of that nature.
Absolutely. How's it going, Kyle?
It's going, man. I still feel like I've been hit by a semi from Sunday or Saturday.
Why, did something happen?
Saturday? What day is today?
Today is Monday. The stream was Saturday.
What happened to yesterday? Did it exist?
I think you went into kind of a fugue state for a while, because you existed across several time zones at once, and the universe caught up with you. That's my guess.
Yeah, that's fair. I think I time traveled, I think is what happened. I think I successfully have handled quantum time. So Anyway, we are here to discuss an incredibly topical topic, an incredibly rich part of the happenings in the comic book industry. The declaration by legendary creator Bill Willingham that his story, Fables, is now in the public domain. And I want to say this. I want to start here. I am working on, and I have a contact, and we've been emailing back and forth on an episode of the Dan Wickline show where we're going to bring you guys a what is public domain topic. Neither Bronze nor I think, are qualified. I don't think Bronze went to law school.
Not yet.
Are qualified to talk in any kind of legality about this matter, but we are going to talk from a position of fandom and a position of passion about this matter. Now, I may have more legal background than him on it because I've had to sue for it and like some other kind of stuff. And I actually have an IP attorney that I deal with on a weekly basis. So it's this idea of we're going to talk about it in the best way we can, but we're going to try and answer some of the bigger questions, right?
Exactly. And the other thing that we should point out as part of that is even if we did have law degrees, this is a topic where we may not agree on what the interpretation of the law is, as though so often is the case with rights.
It's true. So let's start here. This story kind of came down as I was preparing for Batman Day. It's a tough one for me to really wrap my mind around because I'm coming into it late, as it were. So let's kind of recap the story, shall we?
Yeah, absolutely. So do we want to pull up the Substack article, or we just want to kind of read from it a little bit?
I can just kind of read from it. Because Substack likes to get you to sign up for things, and there's all kinds of pop-ups. So this is I'll just read kind of the beginning, and we can get into each of the points if we would like to here.
Sure.
Fables press release.
Off to a great start.
I'm choking to death. Fables press release. Subject: Fables enters the public domain 15 September 2023 by Bill Willingham for immediate release. The lead. As of now, 15 September 2023, the comic book property called Fables, including all related Fables spin-offs and characters, is now in the public domain.
I declare public domain.
I declare. I'm not going to declare anything because if I do and we find out that just saying it makes it so, Anyway, are in the public domain. What was once wholly owned by Bill Willingham is now owned by everyone for all time. It's done. As most experts will tell you, once it's done, it cannot be undone. Take-backs are neither contemplated nor possible. So the last two sentences are the sentences that are questionable. And the first three sentences are also sentences that are questionable. But we're going to get into that. Bill Willingham, the creator of Fables, has had a falling out with the publication company known as DC Comics, and has removed or has attempted to move his property Fables away from any ownership claims DC has and into the public domain. So what does that mean? I guess the answer to that is it means if I want to make a Fables comic, I can make a Fables comic. Yeah. But I might get sued by DC because this is a nebulous thing.
By the way, you are starting to clip a little bit there.
Well, it happens every week, and every week you tell me, and every week I don't care as much.
Okay, well,
I'll try and fix it, but it happens every week, and every week the idea of reaching over here and turning down my mixer seems more and more effortful.
I just want our beautiful viewers to hear your voice.
I want our viewers to hear a beautiful voice, which means it can't be mine.
I want them to hear our beautiful voices. Yeah, so So basically, a lot of this comes down to in the intro here, like Kyle was saying, there has been a formation of some sour grapes. We'll get into the details of what at least Bill Willingham's side is of that as we go through his statement. But yeah, he's saying now he wants to release this to the wild to, in a way, seemingly kind of wipe his hands of it, and maybe kind of as a subtle or not so subtle, flipping the bird to DC a little bit. Maybe it seems to be a big part of this. But luckily, he actually does do this in an FAQ format, so we can kind of get his take on things. Would you like me to go ahead and tackle that next section?
I can keep reading this if you'll keep summarizing, because you do a better job at it than I do.
Sounds good.
Why did you do this? Why did you do this? A number of reasons. I've thought this over for some time. In no particular order, they are: 1, practicality. When I first signed my creator-owned publishing contract with DC Comics, the company was run by honest men and women of integrity who, for the most part, interpreted the details of that agreement fairly and above board. When problems inevitably came up, we worked it out like reasonable men and women. Since then, over the span of 20 years or so, those people have left or been fired to be replaced by a revolving door of strangers of no measurable integrity who now choose to interpret every facet of our contract in a way that only benefit DC Comics and its owner companies. At one time, the Fables properties were in good hands, and now, by virtue of attrition and employee replacement, the Fables properties have fallen into bad hands. We need to say something here, and this is something we probably should have said at the top. As we work through this Substack, these are the opinions of Bill Willingham, not the experience, myself, Bronze Age Nerd, producer Jay, anyone at the experience, or anyone other than Bill Willingham.
Right. 100%. Very important point.
All opinions expressed herein are those of the people who wrote them originally and not the people reporting on them.
Fair.
So he continues to say, since I can't afford to sue DC to force them to live up to the letter of and the spirit of our longtime agreements, even when winning such a suit would take ridiculous amounts of money, out of my pocket and years of my life, I'm 67 years old and don't have many years to spare, I've decided to take a different approach and fight them in a different arena, inspired by the principles of asymmetric warfare. The one thing in our contract the DC lawyers can't contest or reinterpret to their own benefit is that I am the sole owner of the intellectual property. I could sell it or give it away to whomever I want. I choose to give it to everyone. If I can't prevent Fables from falling into bad hands, at least this is a way I can arrange that it falls into many good hands. Since I truly believe there are still good people in the world, there are more good people in the world than bad ones, I count this as a form of victory.
Yeah, and I think the salient point here that we really need to hit on, there's a couple. The first is, why won't he fight this through more traditional channels? And he says, and I think these are very fair points. They're probably the most understandable and relatable points I can point out in my reading of what he wrote. His pocketbooks may not be as deep as DC, and that could be a hard and protracted legal fight. In the implication and problem with it being a protracted legal fight is that he is approaching 70. 67 may not be so old for some people, and it may be older for others. It's one of those ages where we live in a time where people live beyond that, but we also live in a time where people of that age could go for a number of reasons. And if you don't want to spend the last years of your life that you truly value, I can understand why you might not want to spend 3 to 5 to 7 years or more of that time in a courtroom with one of the largest media corporations on the planet in Warner Brothers. The other part you get to is this interesting, he does talk about this interesting concept of asymmetric warfare, taking that to them, which is very interesting. That's guerrilla warfare, essentially, is what he's talking to there. But the one thing in our contract, this is again a quote from Bill, The one thing in our contract that DC lawyers can't contest or reinterpret to their own belief or own benefit is that I am the sole owner of the intellectual property. That is very fascinating, and it comes down to there's actually one point here where a lot of people have chimed in about their interpretation of this situation legally. And I mentioned and alluded to at the top of the show that legal interpretations of contract and IP law can be very dicey because not everyone agrees. But there's one element that we can say for certain. We have not seen the contract.
Correct. And I think it's important to add at this point that DC's official statement is almost a direct response to this paragraph, to this section. DC's
Absolutely.
official statement is the Fables comic books and graphic novels published by DC, and the storylines. This is the important. So that first part seems like a cop-out, but here's the important part. And the storylines, characters, and elements therein are owned by DC and protected under the copyright laws of the United States and throughout the world in accordance with applicable law, and are not in the public domain. DC reserves all rights and will take such actions as DC seems necessary or appropriate to protect its intellectual property rights. So here's what I know, and we'll go on to the other things that Bill talks about in this in his Substack post going on. The details of the contract are literally everything.
Yeah.
Literally everything. It's Keith is right over here. And we'll get to that in just a second. And Murdoch says, so it sounds like DC is doing, if we published it, we have the right to keep publishing it. And I will say this, most of the time, that is 100% accurate. Most of the time, unless you have a Kenneth, you did not. Sorry, I'm just going to answer that question. Here's the deal. Okay. If you sign a contract with a major company, they own everything you produce while you're there. Period. That is 98% of how these things work. When I worked for the big media conglomerate I worked for in my early 20s, they owned everything I made while I was there because I didn't know better than to negotiate for creator ownership or IP ownership or even the right to retain copies of my material. Okay? So these are all things you have to negotiate into your contracts. And when we have the lawyer in, we will get into kind of what that means, right? How you negotiate those things, how you deal with those things. It's not necessarily a work for hire thing. He was a contract player. Like it wasn't I don't know that it was a work for hire contract. I don't know any of that, but the terms of the contract are everything here. DC sees one set of terms and Bill sees another.
Well, actually, to address that point, at one point later on in his statement, he says that one of the renegotiation attempts was a work for hire agreement. So we could probably assume that at least in his mind, it wasn't work for hire from the outset, right, by that logic.
Right. So that's an important part of this. And as we continue to read through his things, I want you to remember that he is having one interpretation of what his agreement with DC was. DC clearly has a different interpretation. And the way the law in the United States works, they're probably both wrong.
Yeah. That's the best part.
Because any judge in any litigation on this is going to look at the original terms of those original contracts or any subsequent contracts and say, this is what it is. DC, you don't own it entirely. Bill, you don't own it entirely. This is a shared ownership problem. And so does it have the right to revert to the public domain based on other stipulations in that contract? So.
Yes, absolutely, Murdoch. I agree.
Right. And that's the thing. And we'll get into some of this other stuff here.
Yeah.
Let's kind of fight through the rest of his statement and then move on to kind of breaking down each individual segment. Should we do it that way, or should we keep going segment by segment?
I think we should do segment because it is a fairly lengthy article, so it's kind of nice to keep touching base on it, and then there's even parts of this we can possibly skip over too if we need to. Because I think, but yeah, it's up to you really.
All right. So the second thing Bill says is the reason he's doing this is philosophy. In the past decade or so, my thoughts on how to reform the trademark and copyright laws of this country and others, I suppose, have undergone something of a radical transformation. The current laws are a mishmash of unethical backroom deals to keep trademarks and copyrights in the hands of large corporations who can largely afford to buy the outcomes they want. That is untrue. In my template for radical reform of these laws, I would like, in my template for radical reform for those laws, I would like it if any IP is owned by its original creator for up to 20 years from the point of its first publication, then it goes into the public domain for any and all to use. Look, we can get into some of this stuff, but I just want you to understand, and this is an important thing. Bill is now talking about how he feels about things and not how the world works. And I will tell you that the copyright laws are not some mishmash of unethical backroom deals. They are very specifically written to protect the creator of the idea. Very specifically. It's only when the creator of the idea does something like sign a contract and give away those rights that they wind up getting hurt. And here's how I know. And we should have probably done the Kyle Explains Wrestling to Bronze episode first. I have a great many friends who are professional wrestlers. Something that happens in professional wrestling is WWE gives you a name, right? Very few professional wrestlers, especially at that highest level of WWE, are wrestling under their actual given name.
Okay.
WWE now owns that name. Even if you came up with that name, when you sign your contract with WWE, they own that name. And what they can do is they can make merch. They can use your name in promotion. They own your name in perpetuity. Forever. My IP lawyer is actually a guy who specializes in helping wrestlers trademark and copyright their names.
Okay.
So that they own their names. So if you wrestle at WWE under the name Chris Jericho, for instance, you can go to AEW and still be Chris Jericho. Whereas other people have wrestled at WWE under certain names, and when they've gone to other companies have had to use other names. My favorite is a guy who worked at WWE named Fandango. He now wrestles under the name Dirty Dango because it's different. But when he was wrestling under his regular name, nobody knew who he was. So it's this idea of these big companies, when you sign away the rights to the things you create, then own them.
Yeah.
But if you don't sign away your rights, then you're fine. You own it because you created it. And that's how copyright law works and IP law works on the most basic sense.
I will say that I have a feeling that and this is just my feeling on this. This is a purely speculative comment, that when Bill's talking about the unethical backroom deals and having enough money to buy the outcome that you want, to largely afford to buy the outcome you want, he may be referring to forces at play like Disney, which has fought to extend the copyrights of characters like Mickey Mouse to make sure that they can hold on to it for longer and longer, that has happened. So I wonder if he means that, or he could have some more specific examples in mind as well. But that's how I read that. But yes, the first the current laws are a mishmash of unethical backroom deals is definitely this almost reads as like a manifesto when you get to these couple paragraphs.
Yes, it
of
really
what he would
does
like.
turn into kind of that.
Yeah.
Murdoch, I actually can answer that question and how some of that worked, but that is a whole other episode for a whole different day, my friend. Sergeant Slaughter's, it was way more complicated than just a simple IP deal.
I would be interested in looking through wrestling through that lens, because the character Sergeant Slaughter is something that I actually care about when it comes to wrestling.
I can tell you in short terms that there are categories to IP and copyrights. So if I own, I actually have a copyright on the phrase "What's up the internet" with certain punctuation, obviously, in certain phraseology. "What's up the internet" is owned by me. Now, I only own it for entertainment and streaming rights. Anyone could make a T-shirt that says "What's up the internet" and own the trademark in apparel. Anybody could make a game called "What's Up the Internet" in gaming, right? So you when you file a trademark or a copyright, you do it in the category in which you wish to own it. Okay. One of the things that's interesting about what WWE does is they try and own it in every category.
Got it.
What they did with Sergeant Slaughter more or less amounts to letting it expire in a certain category only, and working out a deal with Hasbro to let Hasbro own it and WWE own it. Like I said, way more complicated than that. Anyway, what has DC done to provoke this? This is more manifesto-y. Too many things to list exhaustively, but here are some highlights. Throughout the years of my business relationship with DC, with Fables and other intellectual properties, DC has always been in violation of their agreements with me. Usually it's smaller matters, like forgetting to seek my opinion on artists for new stories, or for covers or formats of new collections and such. In these times, when called on it, they automatically said, "Sorry, we overlooked you again. It just fell through the cracks." They used fell through the cracks line so often and reflexively that I eventually had to bar them from using it ever again. They are often late reporting royalties and often underreport said royalties, forcing me to go after them to pay me the rest of what's owed. Look, I'm going to skip the rest of this section after that. And here's why. These are all, again, things that are stipulated and contracted. And without knowing the contract, we can't assess the validity of those statements.
I will not quote, but I want to paraphrase one point he makes in here that I think will be important for later discussion.
There's other things here that we just want to hit on individually.
Yeah.
I'm not going to read it verbatim.
And the point is that the thrust of some of what he says in the statement, of course, you could go read this yourself. You can easily Google it. Is that he's saying that the ownership, not the ownership, the management at DC has changed so much over the years that it now no longer. Again, I'm paraphrasing here. It no longer resembles the original people that he had agreements with. There is that as well, of course. So the point being that he went from having relationships with people to having a quote unquote relationship with a corporation.
It's the difference between being friends and work proximity associates.
Right.
I say all the time that I don't have friends. I just have a lot of work proximity associates. But the truth is, it's the difference between having friends and having people you are friendly with because you work together.
Yeah.
And that's something we're going to touch on more later, because of kind of the big question that I want to tackle. Are you concerned what DC will do now? No. Should be. I gave them years to do the right thing. I tried to reason with them, but you can't reason with the unreasonable. Well, I I have this thing, and this has been my problem with this Substack article as I've been reading it for 3 days. You cannot let your emotions be your argument in law. You can't. Your emotions cloud your judgment and they cloud your reality. Right? If you get angry about something, which Bill clearly is, you stop looking at all the angles and in all the places, and you start complaining. Or you start jumping up and down and crying, right? And you can't win an argument from that perspective. You have to, especially when dealing with a corporation, come with logic and receipts. You can use your anger as your fuel, and you can use your anger to justify your argument, but it cannot be your entire argument.
I would how do I want to say this? So I'm not agreeing with Mr. Willingham's approach here, but I do have a take on why this article is worded the way it is and potentially why this is happening at all. And that take is that I believe that the thesis statement, which he did list at the top, is that in his opinion, his reading of this, which who knows, perhaps he consulted lawyers before making this statement. We don't know, as far as I know. He thinks he can declare it's public domain. And so if that's true, I'm not saying it is, but if that's true, what you do after that really doesn't matter. It sounds as if he's trying to explain to people that might be fans of his or the readers, look, here's why I did this. Here's why I got to this point. Right or wrong, that's my take on it. Why that may play into things. I had a Twitter interaction or an X interaction with Chris from Comic Tropes over this one, where he kind of posted about this and said, I'm confused, what the point of this even would be. And what my reply was, and he replied back to it, is it could be to get eyes on the situation. It could be to get media attention involved. And that has certainly worked. If that was the goal, if you just released a statement saying that you're upset with DC over money and rights and all this different stuff, I don't know how much attention it would have really gotten. It would have gotten some. This has been a talked about story, we're talking about it right now on a stream. It's been a talked about news story in the comic book community for days now. So it's possible he's using this as maybe an opening move in larger negotiations or just to kind of highlight what he thinks is wrong with that company. And if that's the case, it may have been pretty effective. That also might not be the case. I am purely speculating there.
Yeah, I don't know. It's that thing. This reads to me in a big way like that thing where you broke up with your girlfriend and now you're trying to convince everybody she's crazy. Right?
Yeah, a bit.
So I think that's what a lot of these are starting to read.
I do. I want to read this other thing he wrote too. That I think this is an important point. He does say in that same point, and I'll read this part as a quote. Note that my contracts with DC Comics are still in force. I did nothing to break them, and I cannot unilaterally end them. I still can't publish Fables comics through anyone but them. I still can't authorize a Fables movie through anyone but them, nor can I license Fables toys, nor lunchboxes, nor anything else, and they still have to pay me for the books they publish. And I'm not going to give up on the other money that they owe me for games and such. However, you, speaking to the audience, the new 100% owner of Fables, never signed such agreements for better or worse. DC and I are still locked together in this unhappy marriage, perhaps for all time, but you aren't. And I think that's important to point out because some, I think, that may not have read this entire article, entire post, may think that there's a selfish motive here to start publishing his own Fable stuff. He's straight up saying, I'm not doing that. I can't do that, or at least if he knows the implications if he did do that. He's just saying that other people could. in his interpretation.
Can we just point out that those two paragraphs contradict each other? He can't do it, but you can.
Well,
so DC still owns it, at least the stuff I already made. But you can make stuff with these things I've already made, and DC doesn't own it. But I'm not going to let DC go over the stuff they own. Well, if you're going to keep beating DC over the head with the stuff they own, they're going to own everything. Those two paragraphs contradict each other.
I think from his perspective, they may not, in the sense that he's saying he thinks he understands the terms of the contract, and he knows he can't publish works without their approval, but that he can, since he is the owner of the original IP, not the licensing agreements that come on top of that with DC, he can take the greater IP and say it's now public domain. But that doesn't negate the arrangement that he has with DC about publishing comics, licensing, those different agreements. Again, I am not saying he's correct, but I feel like that's the logic that's being presented here. And again, without seeing the contract, there's very possibly wording in there that could give him that impression. I could see that being the case. I think this is a great time to bring up Murdoch's comment here. I'm going to pull this up.
Absolutely.
It says, nothing against Mr. Willingham, but aren't the vast majority of the Fables characters public domain anyway? And you're right. Characters such as Snow White, I mean, these are public domain characters. But the interpretation that a company publishes of that character, the stories that they're involved in that make up their unique origin as that character, are IP that are then associated with that publishing company. You can write your own Snow White story, but she can't have the same background as the Fables character and the same events that happen to them in those stories to then be that identity. As far as I understand it, the whole thing under the caveat that I am not a lawyer, but that's how I interpret that.
Yeah, it's a right. You're already playing in a weird pool.
Yes,
working with these characters and then diving in further to say you own these characters. You don't. You own the box you put them in. And then you're not even the person who's sending the box out. Like, so you don't even own the entirety of them. So I'm just going to come out and say it. And as much as it pains me to say it, I come down on the side of DC on this one. And here's why. I don't think that, one, you can just throw your stuff into public domain. I don't think that's how it works. You can if it's not something that you've ever done anything with, right? You can if it's something that it's really a new idea. But once you have a 40-year history with something, it's owned by someone. And right, Mickey Mouse will be in the public domain next year in 2024. Marvel or Disney can do nothing to prevent that at this point. Nothing.
But it's very important to point out it's not the Mickey Mouse that you've seen in a TV show or movie last year. It's the original version of Mickey Mouse that's in public domain.
Right.
Again, as I understand it, and please understand that I know I'm treading in deep waters as somebody who barely has their floaties on. But yeah, that's an important distinction. It's not like any of them, you can't do Fantasia in your own story because that would still be under some copyright laws, again, as I understand it.
Right. So I think it's important to remember those things, right? Like that as it sits, in order to create a copyright, you have to create something new. So, all right, we've been 40 minutes just breaking this down. Let's get into the question, shall we?
Yeah.
Who owns what we love? Do we as fans own it? Do the people who originally created them own it? Or do the companies that put them into the universe own them? And I think it's an interesting thing to ask, only because very little of what we consume actually comes from the people who created it. Star Wars does not come directly from George Lucas. He's not mailing out Star Wars DVDs.
Yeah.
Right? And he never has. Even when he owned Star Wars, his studio owned Star Wars and not George Lucas. Right? Marvel doesn't own Spider-Man. Disney owns Spider-Man. Or that's a bad example. Marvel doesn't own Iron Man. Disney owns Iron Man. Because that's how that works. Because that's what the original creators signed over the rights for. And then that company can decide who they want to work on it, when they want them to work on it, what they want them to do with it, and how they want it delivered. That's the whole of it, right? Once you sign away your rights, and again, this all goes back to the original terms of contract, and I'm going to bet all the money in my pocket right now that Bill Willingham signed away his rights to Fables. Over the years, that the language of his contract is such that while he is a co-owner, the rights holder is DC. And it goes back to that, Murdoch said it earlier. According to the U.S. Copyright Office, Bill Willingham and DC are copyright holders of Fables copyrights. So if the U.S. Copyright Office has it registered to both people, it is a co-ownership agreement. It's co-parenting. You can't make the decision without the other one. So, again, when we talk about who owns what we love, it's an incredibly complicated question, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and you get to one other thing that Murdoch said here that's actually important too. He never got lawyers involved in 20 years. Now, I don't know, and you may know better than I do, Kyle, or the chat. I've heard over several times when these copyright arguments come up that there is a obligation from the rights holder to defend their property, and if they don't, it can muddy the waters as to the ownership of that. So if he really did have ownership, or it was a very strong case that he had it, but he hasn't contested that in court over some of these actions that he hasn't approved of as the quote unquote copyright holder or IP holder, then that could really weaken his position too, as far as I understand it.
So there's a wonderful story that I love to tell about this idea of having to defend your copyright. In the United States, it's called Pokemon. That is not exactly what it's called in other places. And in Japan, the word monster is still frequently part of the name of Pokemon. A few years back, Coca-Cola sued the I forget who it even is that publishes Pokemon now. Right, what the company is.
I think it's like the Pokemon Corporation of America or something, or
well, no, like worldwide.
Oh, okay.
Like the video games and stuff.
Yeah.
For the use of the word monster, because Monster Energy is a trademark and copyright of Coca-Cola.
Sure.
Or at the time it was. Like, I think they're their own thing now. But at the time it was. And so the Pokemon company had to defend their copyright against Monster Energy. Monster has sued literally thousands and thousands and thousands of people for use of the word monster. It's a thing. It's why you've never heard of a wrestler called the Monster. You have to be able to defend your copyright. So that's a big deal in this. And if for 20 years DC has been in violation and Bill hasn't taken that step of saying, all right, here's this creator-owned contract. Here are lawyers. Tell me if I can do anything. Filed suit, gone through an mediation process, gone through any of these things to try to resolve these violations. He hasn't defended his right to the copyright.
Yeah.
And here's a question I would like to ask Mr. Willingham. Interestingly, was his contract with DC as a mainline company, or was his a Vertigo contract? And while they're the same company, they were different imprints.
Yeah.
So when you allowed Fables to be published by DC mainline, did that change the holding of the copyright? Gibson has been dealing for this stuff as well with Les Paul copies. They've won some and lost some as well. Right. At this point, the words Les Paul are more synonymous with a type of guitar than the company that makes them. Gibson could copyright Gibson Les Paul, but they can't copyright the name Les Paul because at this point, Les Paul's name would be in public domain anymore. I love this stuff, by the way. This is my jam.
Cool.
As much as I don't care about drama in other things, this is the drama that gets me out of bed in the morning because I love very specific, very nuanced drama.
Fair enough.
Like these people that are ripping customers off or whatever, I'll get into that once the cases start coming out and the lawsuits start getting filed.
Yeah.
It's very specific drama.
Well, and speaking of kind of the drama element, I've been talking about the nuts and bolts of the situation, but you raised the question, who owns it, and who, is it the fans? Is it the publisher? Is it the creator? And really, to me, what it comes down to, and again, as somebody who's not a lawyer, but who understands the realities of the world in capitalist corporate America, there is, and international law for that matter, it's kind of obvious that in some ways it's all of those things. Because, and it's great that you brought up Star Wars. So Star Wars is one of my favorite examples of how this works. I am a weird OCD purist when it comes to Star Wars. I want desperately for 4K Blu-ray remasters of the original movies as they were presented in the theaters to be released. George Lucas was clearly opposed to that. Ironic that he actually at one point defended the idea that once a movie is released, it belongs to everybody as it was originally released, and shouldn't be altered. But let's just gloss over that for a point. That he didn't want those versions of those movies released. As a fan, that's the version I loved. That's the version I wanted. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of that, but that I felt ownership of those movies in the sense that that was the version that I wanted to show my children someday. That's the version that I hope that people remembered someday, or whatever. And maybe that's a weird example. That's just how I felt about it. But George Lucas had a different idea, and he had control over what could be released. And now Disney owns that. And clearly they've owned it for a while now. And Disney is a company that I don't know if you know anything about Disney. Disney's a company that likes to make some money. And yet they still haven't released that version of those films, which a lot of fans have clamored for a long time. So there may be some sort of stipulation in that purchase that has some sort of period of time where they're not able to do that. Or they just have no desire to. That's possible too. We don't know. But ultimately, I can't make Disney release that version. So the fan clearly doesn't own it in a legal sense. The creator has, like you said, Lucasfilm was at one point the owner. Now it's, Lucasfilm is in the Disney of things. It's this whole issue where really the ultimate holder in this world is the person that, to simplify it, financed what went out there. They were the publisher, they released it. They were the ones putting up the cost for the prints and all that to go out there. And where you kind of run into this with creators And again, George Lucas is a fantastic example for this, is because the thing that George Lucas infamously did when Star Wars was coming out, is he didn't ask for cuts, of the profits of the film in traditional ways. He asked for the licensing rights to merchandise. And that changed how merchandise and associated costs are done with movies forever. I don't think a studio in the world is going to give that same ability to somebody now after they saw what happened with Star Wars. And the point is that they're the ones that hold all the bucks.
There's one example, but it's a really dumb example.
Okay.
Adam Sandler has all the merchandising rights to all of the Adam Sandler movies.
That's okay. Yeah, no, fair enough. I mean,
is anybody going to make an Adam Sandler a Grown Ups 2 action figure? No. So it doesn't really matter, but it's true. It's happened only a couple of times, and it's only happened with stars or with things that are big enough that they can sort of start to dictate those terms.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what it comes down to. It's to me, it's so maybe not from a strictly legal perspective, I understand that, but from a reality perspective, it's a symbiosis that kind of has to exist. Mm-hmm. But here's the real problem. Here's the element I want to get to, where I fully support Bill in what he has to say, is sharing his experiences of what he felt happened in his dealings with DC as a creator. You cannot expect, and I've said this about other things other times, and this is a very important point to me. You cannot expect creators to continue to want to create for your company that makes comic books if you're going to treat them like this. Again, it's his account. For all we know, that's not how he's actually treated. But assuming everything he said is true, just for the sake of the argument, that would not be a good way to encourage other creators to come to your side and make new stories and new characters for you. It's already dicey. Like I honestly couldn't tell you, why would anyone want to go create some awesome new character for Marvel, for example?
Well, and that's something they've been talking about for a while, right? Like, yeah. Nobody wants to create anything new. I mean, the last big new character that they created was probably Null for Marvel.
Spider-Boy, maybe now.
Yeah, Spider-Boy maybe, but that's another different thing, right? Like, creator owned versus work for hire versus contract player versus
definitely
and again, we go back to this idea of the letter of the contract, right? Like, and Murdoch, you have to be pedantic here.
Yeah,
like that's the whole ball of wax. And so it's this idea of the letter of the contract is how the letter of the contract works. And Bill's problem is that for years, because he's Bill Willingham, DC kind of said, all right, Bill, that's not exactly what the contract says, but we understand that's what you thought it should have said, or you believe that it said, or your interpretation of based on your reading of your contract. Fine, we'll just cop to that. And now, because DC isn't DC anymore, DC is Warner Discovery, and DC is literally getting, like, they're losing money hand over fist for this big company. Their lawyers are saying, we can't do that anymore. We have to hold you to the letter of the contract, which is what they should have been doing all along. It's the other thing I feel, and I'll be honest, 99 times out of 100, I'm going to come down on Bill's side. 99 times out of 100. But the idea is but the people who were running them are like that parent who tells you can have one cookie, and then when you cry, gives you another cookie. Right? Like, Dan DiDio did Bill no favors. If they had always just held him to the letter of his contract, we would be at this point now where he either would have never re-signed and never agreed to go back to them because he didn't like it, or he would have negotiated new contracts better, or he would have known what to expect. The problem that when I read this post is that he feels like DC moved the goalpost. Right? That he had control. He had absolute control over this thing. And then they said, no, you don't. And it's not moving the goalpost. It's just enforcing an already in language expectation.
Yeah.
And so that, to me, is where this really goes off the rails. Now, there's something else that I want to mention at the very least here, which is going back to that statement of they've been in violation for 20 years. If Bill can, in fact, prove that DC violated their part of the contract when he, in fact, did not, the rights could revert to him retroactively. Right? If 20 years ago, DC actually violated his contract, and he's got the proof, then it becomes incumbent on them to prove that he okayed their violation of his contract. And that's a whole other thing of who said, he said, she said, they said, and I'm guessing some of these people are dead.
Well, like you said, it'll come down to also what the judge in question's interpretation of that original contract is to determine, was there actually a violation based on that contract? There are judges that are more sympathetic to things like these than others. They have a certain interpretation versus others. So that's going to play a huge part in the outcome as well, which is unfortunately an element of our justice system that is just inherent into how it's structured now. So that is unfortunate because it may work out either way just based on the judge that reviews the case. But yeah, it is absolutely something that will be fascinating to follow along with, and it could have some implications for a lot of other content out there in not just comic books, but in other media too.
Right. I mean, when you think about this is going on YouTube. YouTube is owned by Google. So who owns this? Do we own this or does YouTube own this? Does Google own this? Like, because Google is the one paying for the bandwidth that you're using to watch it. Like, there's a lot of, there's a lot of if-then statements that we have to parse.
Yeah.
And Murdoch's right. Bill kind of made his bed. Right? DC is not a company, and this is something we talked about. Bronze, you and I talked about when we were prepping. DC is not a company that does a lot of creator-owned stuff. There are companies like Aftershock, like Image, like SourcePoint, like Scout, there are some of these companies that do creator-owned comics, and therefore they have mechanisms in place for getting their piece. And then their contracts are specific.
Worth noting, though, that at the time Fables originally came out, there were a lot less options.
Right. No,
that's just throwing it out there.
That Bill made his bed with a company that isn't known for this. Yeah. Right. At the time when Fables came out, they may have been the only game in town. But people were self-publishing. Indies existed.
Oh yeah.
It was hard. You had look at Art Crumb, look at Harvey Picar. Some of
absolutely.
These. Right. Look at Piranha Press. Great example. Has any of that been published anyplace? No. Unless those creators are publishing it. Because it's creator owned. That's part of it, right? DC doesn't have this is our boilerplate, this is what you get, this is what we get contract. You own the rights. If you want to leave, you got to give us 6 months. You can't publish anywhere else for 6 months or whatever. I have a friend who worked with Devil's Due. And when he wanted to take his IP away from Devil's Due and go to the Kickstarter route and go fully self-published for a minute and then sign up with another creator-owned publisher, he had to wait 6 months. That was it. Or And I have another friend who was doing the same thing who had to buy their backstock. Fine. But those were written into the letter of their contracts. It's, again, anyway. So I have this, Dark Horse or Image were good options.
Yeah, I would think there's a lot less options. I wasn't saying there was no options, but
Right.
yeah.
So here's the big question I really wanted to throw out there and get your opinion on. And somebody said it earlier. I think it was Frog Brawler. I feel like this is a dude in the twilight of his career, dissatisfied with the overall management of DC, and it's been death by 1,000 paper cuts. He's just trying to make them lose money now. There was a time where comics were handshake agreements, right? Where it was when Siegel and Schuster took Superman to Warner Brothers and formed DC Comics, basically. It was a handshake agreement. And when the company screwed them, it took Neil Adams banging a drum very loud at peak Neil Adams to get them really recognized, right? To get them actually compensated for what they were owed. And even then, it was fractions, right?
Yeah.
Netta, that's not even close to on topic. The question I have is, companies like DC and Marvel are having remarkable turnover.
Yeah.
Because of cost cutting, because of restructuring, because why do you need a CEO of Disney or of Marvel when you have a CEO of Disney who owns Marvel? Like, can't you just put somebody in charge? So these people who, guys like Bill Willingham, guys like we talked to Jim Starlin on Saturday, guys like Jim Starlin, who they were friends with, are no longer there. Joe Quesada is no longer at Marvel. So if you're Jimmy Palmiotti and you came to Marvel because your pal Joe Quesada was going to Marvel, you don't have that in anymore, right? Bill Willingham doesn't have Dan DiDio. Bill Willingham doesn't have, I'll be honest, there's a number of guys working for Dynamite. There's a number of guys working for AWA. There's a number of guys working for other publishers that used to work at DC or Marvel.
Yeah.
Who aren't there because those companies chose to fire them or not renew their contracts or whatever.
Right.
Those guys had something that is more of a political term, but it's institutional memory. When the last person is working for DC that learned from Carmine Infantino, when that person leaves DC, everything Carmine Infantino taught anyone is gone. Marvel probably does have a very different HR structure, and HR is a whole different thing, Murdoch, I think. But what I'm saying is the institutional memory leaves, right? People who remember what it was like to sit in the Marvel bullpen don't work at Marvel anymore. Or if they do, it's very specific case-by-case stuff, right? Or they're dead.
Or they're remembering stories that were told to them.
Right. They weren't there. People who remember what it was like when DC had its offices in New York are almost not there anymore. And guys, that was less than 5 years ago. I mean, really. Remember when Convergence came out? That was because DC was moving to LA from New York. So when the institutional memory leaves, what is left for a guy like Bill Willingham, whose entire deal was structured or seems to have been based on existing institutional memory?
Yeah, it's one of those things where, what I come back to is this idea that I want comics to be successful for decades to come. But in order for that to be true, we need creators, artists, writers to bring stories that will engage new audiences. You know, I think that there's this very clear idea that you could come into DC and tell an awesome new Batman story. You could come into Marvel and tell an awesome new X-Men story. And it could become like the next jumping on point for a lot of new readers. That's possible. It's not very likely. You could create a brand new comic book that is going to engage people. That is much more likely. I think the odds are still stacked against it. And part of the reason are these business arrangements, the way that the deals are structured. It's just not very favorable for creators. So that is where I am empathetic to Bill Willingham and how he feels about what's going on. I agree with Kyle that at the end of the day, I have a strong feeling that DC is going to win any type of discussion that revolves around this. But it doesn't mean that I don't want justice for creators and things like when this fantastic new movie comes out with your character, you should be receiving some of the benefit of that. 100%.
And it's like I said, 99 times out of 100, I'm going to come down on the side of Bill Willingham, right?
Yeah.
If this was a question about Fabrice Sapolsky and Spider-Man Noir, I'm going to come down on the side of Fabrice. But this is a very different situation in that it's not like Fabrice is getting screwed over a character he created as a company that he created it for continues to move on with it. This is a creator saying, this is something that I gave to them. This is something we co-created. This is something it was a creator-owned contract with this company. Fabrice didn't own his character. It wasn't creator-owned. So he has no ownership stake. He should have had ownership stake. Yeah. This is you have ownership stake and you failed to be a good steward of your ownership stake. There's some comments that I want to kind of. Murdoch says to my Carmine Infantino, not really someone who worked with that person, who worked with Carmine Infantino. Whoever worked for Carmine should have passed the knowledge on, unless they're in an order. But that's not how shared knowledge works. So, Jay, pop on for a second. Jay, who taught you about television production?
You did.
Yeah, except that I didn't teach myself. I learned from somebody. So did the person who taught me teach you?
No, because I'm pretty sure that you put your own lessons that you learned into what you taught me.
Thank you, Jay.
Welcome.
That's how shared knowledge works, right? Like I learned something, then I share it with someone else, but what I learned is not the same thing I learned because I have my own experience. And so, again, what I'm saying is institutional memory is so important in comics, or we assume it exists, and it doesn't. And Bill Willingham is assuming it exists, and it doesn't. So is this really, depending on how this shakes down, the death of this kind of older generation of creators who were okay with signing handshake agreements or agreements with principle, or did agreements in good faith, and the birth of the creator who does exactly what the contract says, nothing more, nothing less.
Yeah, and that is the fascinating concept, is that nothing more, nothing less. It's something that's actually very prevalent in the workforce today among the younger generation of workers. There's this idea of it kind of ties into the quiet quitting movement a little bit, but there's this concept of you're paying me for this job. Why would I ever exceed those expectations.
Right.
And it's something that you think about it, it's what I'm talking about with trying to bring in new creators. Well, guess what? Those new creators are going to need to be drawn from this younger generation who more times than not has that perspective. And situations like this do not encourage, they don't curry good favor with those creators to do more than what they're asked, especially for the big two.
Right. And so here's my concern about all of this. If it goes the way I think we both think it's going to go, and it's the Dwayne, I'm going to answer Dwayne's statement in a second. The worst thing that can possibly happen to the comics industry is what I think is going to happen. DC is going to quash whatever this is. They're going to pay Bill off to retract this statement and put out a statement that it's not true. It's not actually that, there's going to be some sort of squashing of this issue, right? And comics employees, comic creators are going to essentially work for these companies the same way my 16-year-old, my friend's 16-year-old works for Panera Bread. You do what they tell you. You do nothing more. You do nothing less. You have no ownership. You have no stake. You have no pride in your work. You might have pride in your work, but you have no. You're
not invested.
There's no benefits, right? There's no investment in it. Dwayne, I don't believe in doing that. The second I learn something better, I share it. I am a Platonian in that regard. All good things should flow into the boulevard. And that's a thing for me. So not entirely true, but it is true of others. The guy who taught me didn't teach me everything he knew. Right? There was stuff I had to learn on my own by doing. And there are things Jay has had to learn on his own by doing. And again, Bill Willingham should have learned. Eddie Graham was probably the best single person but he had to learn from others for Dusty Rhodes, Vince McMahon, Fritz von Erich, and others to learn. That's true, Murdoch. But Eddie Graham learned from somebody. And then Vince learned from Eddie. And then Vince taught Trips. And then Triple H has his own experiences as being one of the boys that is dictating how he runs things now. Shared knowledge, once the person who learned from Eddie Graham was no longer around, the things Eddie Graham taught were no longer around. It was the things Vince taught. Yeah, no, you're right, Dwayne. So it's that my big concern is that we're going to see quiet quitting in the comic book industry.
Yeah, I think it's a very genuine concern at this point, and there's an irony in it too, because in some ways, I feel like that's, at least from Marvel's editorial and their presence they had on a company-wide level back in the Silver Age, there's almost a wish fulfillment. That in some ways, that's what they kind of seem to want. Do your job, do what you're told, stay in your lane. Well, you're going to get that. Right. I don't know if you actually want it.
Right? Like, if with that is the death of creativity. And without creativity, then these books would just become rote.
Yep. A lot of those creators, the reason that what they did is so great was, even though that was the direction they were given at the time, they rose above that through a sense of obligation and pride in their work and a desire to be. It could have been their own desire to be the best. It could have been their desire to give the most to their readers. It could have been both. But those things came through in their creations.
Right. And I think, Mike DiCarlo said something to me on Saturday that has resonated with me here. And he basically said, there's no market for what I do anymore. right? There's no market for the kind of art he creates in publishing comics. There's market in nostalgia. There's market in people who are already fans. But these companies don't want people who do the kind of work he does. They want people who are Jim Lee clones, or they want people who are Donny Cates or Ryan Stegman clones, or they want people who draw like, whoever, Todd McFarlane.
Yeah.
They don't want people who draw like John Romita Sr. And I think what you're seeing here with this situation that Bill Willingham finds himself in is the way these companies are sort of forcing that forward movement. Oh, you're this old school creator on this kind of legacy contract over here, that has been a thing, right, for a while, right? Oh, we're sorry we didn't consult you. They maybe consulted the guys who are in the office or the guys who are currently working for them, because those are the guys who are getting the big contracts. Those are the guys who are getting the current attention, right? And all of a sudden, you're pushing these guys out by death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's the same as the auto worker who spent 30 or 20 years standing on an assembly line, putting a bolt in a hole. And then they replaced him with a robot, and he was unwilling to learn how to run the robot. Right? I think it's the same thing, right? It's the industry is moving forward in a different direction than where some of these people have their existence.
Yeah, and to me, a lot of this comes down to in the case of DC versus Bill Willingham. I'm reminded of the great quote from The Big Lebowski, where the dude tells Walter, "No, Walter, you're not wrong. You're just the a-hole." And that's kind of a little bit what's going on here. It's not that DC's probably going to win this. They're probably going to be declared the ultimate victor in this situation. But it doesn't mean that the way that they got there is the correct way forward. And that should be the lesson that I'm sure DC will ignore.
Well, but I here's my question. How many creator-owned contracts do DC currently have? I wonder.
Right.
How many people are in this same situation? Or has DC already learned this lesson because of the Alan Moore stuff? Because of some of the other instances where they've had bad experiences with guys doing creator-owned, that they just don't offer them anymore. Right? Or that when they do offer them, they offer them that are so narrowly drawn that it takes this entire conversation out of the what's what I'm looking for? They're so narrowly drawn, it takes the whole thing out of its out of the conversation, right?
Right.
Like, the contracts, the creator-owned contracts are so specific and so narrowly drawn. And by the way, everybody's got a lawyer now. They might not have at the time. This stuff, and to tell them what they're giving up and what they're not, and what the company owns and what they don't. So at the end of the day, it wouldn't shock me if this kind of thing never comes up again, because the companies have already learned this lesson. Right. DC exists to harvest IP.
Yeah.
They don't want creator-owned. They want to own. So if you go to DC with a creator-owned idea, unless you're someone they already have a big contract with, they probably won't even hear you. And even then, when you come to them and say, I have an idea for a new thing, a creator-owned thing, they will probably tell you, oh, well, we're not going to take it unless we can own it. Nice House on the Lake is a DC property.
Yeah.
But I think they own it. I don't think Tinian owns it.
Yeah, I mean, with a creator like Tinian, I wouldn't be surprised if he's tied up in some of the back end arrangements that might come from it, but still the ownership is on DC almost certainly.
Right. It's, you talk about an ownership share, a minority stakeholder.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. And like I said, I'm guessing DC learned these lessons.
And by the way, creators have probably like we were saying earlier, like why would anyone go work for DC at this point as a creator owned? Why would they want DC to be their publisher? What, you know, like Murdoch pointed out back in 2002, Dark Horse, Image. Why wouldn't you go with one of those options instead that can help you do that?
No, we had David Pepose on Talking Shop today. He has a book coming out from Mad Cave called The Devil That Wears My Face. David has a great relationship with Marvel, doing a ton of stuff for Marvel. Why wouldn't he take that to Marvel? Because Marvel would want to own it.
Yeah.
Not that Marvel would ever publish a straight horror book, like it's just not their jive, but you know, why would he would never take it to them because they'd want to own it.
Yep.
So, you know, it's, I don't know, from a fan perspective and from kind of an outside perspective, and not being as much experience as I have in this area legally, because I have more than I wish I had. Like, I'm going to be real honest with you. I have a pretty fair amount of experience in this just from my own life. There you go. Care of DC. I'm guessing DC owns the majority. But we're not lawyers. We'll have a lawyer on to talk about this. But I think the thing we need to at this point do is support Bill Willingham, right? And whatever comes next. But just remember that because he's the creator doesn't necessarily mean he's right.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think that's kind of where we come to on this particular topic. It is something I think that'll be great to follow up on too, as we do see some movement and hopefully resolution on the topic as time goes on. Which I think will happen. We'll probably get something out of it.
Right. If you have ideas of things we should talk about, the link is in the chat, bit.ly/Devil's Advocates.
Please do.
Join both Bronze's Discord and our Discord. Those are great places to talk to us about stuff.
Yeah.
There are other great shows coming up on the Experience this week, including a new favorite of mine. Well, not a new favorite, an old favorite that's back, the Comic Book Beardies on Thursday nights. Make sure you check out that if you haven't already. Bronze and I will be back next week, where we will be talking about something.
TBD. Maybe one of your ideas if you follow the link that we posted in chat.
Absolutely. So, for Bronze and Jay in the background, I have been producer Kyle. All rights reserved. What's up, the internet? This has been Devil's Advocates. We'll see you next time.
Join the party. Head over to our link tree to find all the links for everywhere the experience is all the time.